Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Angela Tadamachi. I'm part of the marketing and events team here at AuditBoard, and I'm excited to host today's presentation. I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker. Gavin Hayes is the head of policy and external affairs at the Chartered Institute of Internal Auditors. Before I hand the mic over, I have a few housekeeping items to cover. First, today's presentation slides will be shared with all participants. They are also available within the resource list on the left. Along the bottom, you'll find our most frequently asked questions, including solutions to common technical issues. If you lose audio at any point during today's presentation, please try refreshing your browser to reconnect. I would love to hear from you during the presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to send them through the Q&A widget at the bottom left of your screen. We'll be answering questions at the end. And last, to qualify for CPE, you must attend 15 minutes of the live session and answer 3 poll questions. If you qualify for your CPE, your certificate will be emailed to you after the webinar. If you do not receive your certificate by the end of the day, please reach out to events@auditboard.com. And now let's kick things off by welcoming Gavin.
Hello, everyone. As Angela said, my name is Gavin Hayes, and I'm Head of Policy and External Affairs at the Chartered Institute of Internal Auditors, UK and Ireland. And it's an absolute delight to be able to join you today from London. And I understand that over 2,000 people have registered for this webinar. And it's so great to be joined by internal auditors from across the globe. So today, I'm going to give you a comprehensive overview of the findings of our new research report, Cultivating a Healthy Culture, Why Internal Audit and Boards Must Take Corporate Culture More Seriously in a Post-COVID World. And we're really pleased that the report has been published in partnership with AuditBoard, but also with insights from the London Business School's Leadership Institute. And I also just use this opportunity to thank Richard, John, Scott, Melissa and Angela, and the entire team at AuditBoard for partnering with us on this exciting project and for all the work you've done in organising this webinar today. And more than anything, I'm also really looking forward to listening to all of your insights and responding to your questions. So let's start today with a bit of context. There can be no doubt that organisational culture and the risks arising from an unhealthy culture are once again rising up the corporate agenda. And this has been driven by changes and operational disruption brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic. With large numbers of the workforce having to work remotely for most of the last 2 years, and the move to hybrid working in the longer term, and new ways of working going forwards, boards are grappling with how to embed and maintain their culture going forwards. And some are starting to talk about the risks of cultural erosion and decay over time. At the same time, organisations are coming under increased pressure from wider society to ensure their culture embraces greater levels of equality, diversity and inclusion. And this has been driven by the inclusion movements, including the Me Too and Black Lives Matter movements, all of which is driving organisational culture change. And here in the UK, there have also been high-profile EDI-related public incidents that have made media headlines. And this includes a racism scandal that recently engulfed the Yorkshire County Cricket Club, which has sadly shone a spotlight on the risks associated with an unhealthy workplace culture. And I understand that there have been similar incidents in the USA involving American college football teams. And these scandals underline the strong interdependence between culture and equality, diversity and inclusion, as well as demonstrate the immense damage a culture crisis can have on long-term sustainability, reputation, and public trust, as well as in terms of attracting and retaining talent. In the Chartered IIA's annual Risk in Focus poll, which is based on the responses of over 700 chief audit executives working across Europe, last year we saw a 35% year-on-year increase in the numbers of CAEs citing organisational culture a top 5 risk. So in response to the growing prominence of this business critical risk, we believe internal audit has a vital role to play, working in collaboration with other business functions in assessing, monitoring, and providing assurance on culture. We would like to see even more internal audit functions stepping up in the culture space. Based on the research findings I'm about to present, our clear message to the profession is to be proactive. Don't wait for the board to come to you before undertaking a culture audit engagement. Do put your head above the parapet if you have concerns regarding your organisational's culture, and be braver and more courageous on culture, and be willing to speak truth to power. So with organisational culture growing in prominence, this is why we wanted to do some fresh research to help get a sense of internal audit's progress as a profession on this risk area, as well as challenge the profession to up its game and to provide some guidance for those who are yet to start their culture journey. The core part of the research was a survey of over 100 senior internal audit executives across the UK and Ireland. We also convened 2 roundtable discussions with senior internal audit executives that were doing or had done interesting work in the culture space. And finally, we put together 2 case studies to share internal audit best practice. And this included the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform of the Government of Ireland, whose internal audit function had conducted a comprehensive culture review, along with Lloyds Banking Group, whose internal audit function is one of the most advanced in the UK and Ireland in terms of the work that it's been doing on culture. So how do we define culture, and why is it so important to the work of internal auditors? So broadly speaking, culture is defined as the shared attitudes, behaviours, principles and values that drive action and purpose within an organisation. And as you may have already heard, it's often referred to as being the way things are done around here. And this was a phrase that was first coined by Charles Handy in his 1981 book, Understanding Culture. And this broad definition of culture was largely reflected by the internal auditors who took part in the open questions in the survey that we ran. However, quite an interesting insight by internal auditors was that culture was also how we do things when people are not watching. So why should all of this matter to internal auditors? Well, culture should matter to internal auditors because having the right culture aligns to the organisation's purpose, values, strategy and vision for the future is vital for the effective leadership, sustainability, resilience and governance of an organisation. In terms of the risk culture, it can also have a significant impact on the internal control and risk management environment. And we've seen time and time again, haven't we, what happens when the culture spirals out of control or is unhealthy. It can cause entire companies to topple over, with the root cause of many company collapses attributed to unhealthy cultures. And this is often fueled by misconduct and the wrong tone from the top. So examples in the UK include BHS, Carillion, Patisserie Valerie, and in the US, these include Enron, WorldCom, Wells Fargo, Lehman Brothers, and in Germany, we had the recent Wirecard collapse. This all demonstrates that it's absolutely vital that internal auditors champion in collaboration with other business functions to monitor, assess, and provide assurance that the culture is healthy. So next, are boards taking culture seriously, or does internal audit need to help give them a bit of a nudge? Firstly, let's be clear on this. Articulating, establishing, and embedding the culture is fundamental to the success of an organisation. Furthermore, the board's leadership role on this is critical, and this includes setting the tone as well as clear expectations, and this is a fact. However, our research would suggest that not enough boards are taking culture as seriously as they should be. While just over 70% of respondents to our survey indicated that their boards had established and articulated what culture it wants, it still left around a quarter who had not. And, you know, given the fact that this is such a fundamental thing to the leadership and governance of an organisation, I thought that it was somewhat shocking that almost a quarter had not established and articulated the culture. And over half of internal auditors that took part in our survey had not been asked by the board or the audit committee to provide reports on culture or EDI initiatives. And only 13% have been asked to discuss the risks posed by culture with the board. So clearly, these results suggest that there is a need for internal audit to engage the board on the importance of a healthy culture. So before we move on to the next part of the presentation, we have a polling question for you, which should be on your screens now. So if you could take a few moments to complete the poll. And the question is, how would you describe your internal audits team's current level of involvement in managing organisational culture and EDI risks? And the options are high, medium, low, no involvement, and unsure. So yeah, I'll be really fascinated to see the results of this question. So yeah, please do take a few moments to complete the poll, and then we will see what the results are. So the results are in. Thank you for everyone that participated. So at the moment, it would appear that most internal auditors that are taking part in the webinar today either have low or no involvement in organisational culture and EDI risks, although we've got about a third who are saying that they have a high or medium involvement. So some interesting results there. Obviously really delighted therefore that many of you are taking part in the webinar today. And I hope that maybe if we ask this poll in a year's time, then maybe the results might be a bit different. Anyway, let's now move on to the next part of the presentation. So the next thing that you really need to be mindful of is that regulators' expectations are rising when it comes to corporate culture. And you should be prepared for greater regulatory scrutiny in this area in the future if you're not already subject to it. Here in the UK and Ireland, financial services regulators now demand far more from their internal audit in the culture space than for some of the more traditional internal audit areas like internal financial controls, for example. And this has been part of regulators' response to the financial crisis in 2008, which exposed issues with risk culture at a number of big banks, which posed a systemic risk to the economy. And I know that it's a similar story with financial services regulators in Australia. And given the fact that we have a global audience tuning into today's webinar, I would be really fascinated if internal auditors in other countries could share your experience in terms of increasing regulators' expectations. But it's also important to understand that it's not just financial services where regulators are demanding more. Here in the UK, the Audit Regulator has in fact strengthened the UK Corporate Governance Code for publicly listed firms to put greater emphasis on the responsibilities of company directors regarding culture. And it's also worth noting in this context that the Dutch have recently announced that their corporate governance code will be updated to put much stronger emphasis on the responsibilities of the board in regards to equality, diversity and inclusion. So some developments there only in the last few weeks. And over 65% of respondents to our survey want the UK code to be further beefed up in relation to culture. So what risks have the most impact on culture? The important thing to say on this is that we shouldn't just treat culture as a risk in its own right or one that sits in a silo, but instead it's a risk that has a significant impact on a broad range of other risks, with other risks also having a big impact on the corporate culture. So the number one risk to have the most impact on culture is human resources, talent management, and recruitment and retention risk, as hopefully you can see on the graph on the slide. And almost 65% cited human resources a top 3 risk to impact the culture. And this was followed by equality, diversity and inclusion risk, and then health, safety and well-being risk. But also important to add that there's a whole plethora of other risks that have an impact too that you may not have thought about. For example, corporate governance, ethics, and reputation, to name just a few. So this means that if you are auditing some of these other risks as part of your audit plans, it would be useful to integrate into these audits an examination of the potential impacts these risks may be having on the corporate culture. So how should you go about tackling culture audits? The key message that came from our roundtable discussions with senior internal audit executives was that when auditing culture, there is really no one-size-fits-all approach. Internal audit should basically customize your approach based on your individual circumstances. However, on saying that, broadly speaking, there are 3 main approaches to auditing culture. So the first of these is that you can undertake a standalone audit of culture. And this is particularly useful if you want to do a holistic deep dive assessment of the culture. And the Irish government's Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, their internal audit function that did a culture review, and this was essentially a standalone audit of culture, and it's a really good example of this. And do take a look at the report and a look at the case study to get a bit more detail on that. And we would certainly encourage all internal audit functions to consider standalone culture audits from time to time. Some internal audit functions also integrate culture into standard audits, and this is very common. So, for example, integrating cultural aspects into audits of HR, audits of EDI, audits of health and safety. You know, given the fact that those three are the biggest risks to impact the corporate culture, those would be the obvious ones where you would include some cultural aspects in those audits. And another approach involves continuous auditing by considering cultural aspects in every audit engagement, including observing behaviours. And as you'll see on the graph on the slide in front of you, in our survey, we found that 37% integrate culture into standard audits. 5% said they were doing a standalone audit, and 18% said they were doing both. Overall, in terms of the results of this question, it was quite positive in that it revealed that 74% of internal audit functions in the UK and Ireland do plan on doing some aspect of culture auditing, either in the coming year or the next year. So we were quite pleased with that result, although obviously we would like to see even more internal audit functions doing some sort of aspect of cultural auditing in the future. So next up, we have another polling question. So the question is, does your audit plan include culture? There are two options, yes or no. I'll be fascinated to find out what your insights are on this. So do just take a few moments to complete the poll. So we've got about 30% who say yes, and we've almost got 70% who say no. So yeah, it seems in terms of the majority of people that are taking part in the webinar today haven't yet engaged in culture auditing. So in fact, I think that's really positive because it means that hopefully after today, you know, you will start your corporate culture journey. So, in terms of those of you who are auditing culture, we have another polling question for you. So, how are culture audits most frequently performed at your organisation? And for this one, we've got 4 options. We've got integrated into standard audits. We've got standalone audits. We've got continuous auditing, and then we've got unsure. So for those of you who are doing some aspect of culture auditing at the moment, take a few moments to take part in the poll, and then we'll reveal the results in just a moment. So I understand some of you might be having a few technical issues at the moment taking part in this poll. So we're just going to leave it a little bit longer before we get the poll results. So please bear with us for just a moment. So we have the results. So almost a quarter are basically saying integrated into standard audits. Almost 19% say standalone audits, 7.5% saying continuous auditing, and just over 50% are unsure. So, yeah, some interesting results there. But obviously, for those of you who haven't yet embarked on culture auditing, we've now outlined 3 approaches in terms of how you might tackle this in the future. So moving on now to the next part of the presentation, the next important thing to be mindful of when auditing culture is the need for cross-organisation collaboration and the important role that internal audit can play in connecting the dots on culture across the whole organisation. And the really important message that we want to try and get across here is that internal audit, as the third line of defence with its helicopter view of the whole organisation, can play a really important role in fostering greater levels of cooperation, collaboration and communication across the business regarding culture, helping to ensure there's a joined-up approach and support the organisation to work together to effectively assess, monitor and embed the culture. And our research found, and probably unsurprisingly, the top business function internal audit collaborates with on culture is unsurprisingly human resources. And this is followed by risk management, compliance, and the company secretary. And you can see the results of the survey on the graph on the screen. So what proxies are used in auditing culture? So the top proxy used by internal auditors in their culture audits is the staff survey, with 76% of respondents to our survey choosing this option. And this was followed by whistleblowing activity, governance structures, values statements and their incorporation into recruitment and performance management, HR grievance data and exit interviews, management of customer complaints, and pay reward and incentive structures. But on using staff surveys, which the vast majority of senior internal auditors said that they use, when we spoke to internal auditors as part of our roundtable discussions, they did raise quite a number of concerns in relation to using staff surveys in their culture audit work. So many reported them sort of being canned or off the shelf. And they also had concerns that management might try to manipulate what staff say in these surveys, particularly if their bonus or performance-related pay is linked to the survey results for their team or business function. So a word of caution, if you're using the staff survey, you should do so with a healthy dose of professional scepticism. And if you're in any doubt, then you can consider doing your own independent survey and getting views that way. Which leads us neatly on to the methods used in culture auditing. So our research found that the top methods for auditing culture is interviews, and 64% of respondents selected this option. This was followed by surveys, and then assessment of timely and effective resolution of audit issues. Obviously, if the scores are low there, that could be a red flag in terms of the risk culture. Behavioural observation was also a method used, along with root cause analysis, cause and effect analysis, workshops, and organisational culture mapping. So really, this just demonstrates that there are a whole array of methods and tools at your disposal to measure, monitor, and assess the culture. And when discussing the methods in our roundtable discussions, we found that often surveys are used as the first stage of the process, and these typically provide a bit of context, they shape the scope of the culture audit, and they basically identify areas for a bit more of a deep dive. And then usually this is followed up by one-to-one interviews and focus groups. But as well as using the, using surveys and using quantitative measures, there really was a very strong emphasis on the need for qualitative research methods to then back that up and get a bit more insight. So what skills and competencies do you need to audit culture? So a bit of a metaphor. Auditing culture is not quite the same as auditing other parts of the business. Typically, as internal auditors, you're renowned for using your sense of sight and sound. But in auditing culture, internal auditors also need to leverage their sense of smell. So that's just to give you an idea of how different the skills are that you need when you are auditing culture. And in our research, we found that the top skills for auditing culture included professional judgment, soft skills, use of experienced internal auditors to lead the work, enhanced communication skills, and influencing and negotiation skills. The other thing to share is that some of the more mature and larger internal audit functions also now employ dedicated organisational psychologists or behavioural risk experts within their teams. But it's also important to say that even in smaller teams, you do need to make sure that you have sufficient knowledge and understanding required to audit culture. So in this sense, auditing culture is really no different than auditing other parts of the business. If you're looking at IT, then you would expect internal auditors to have IT knowledge. If you're auditing cybersecurity, then you expect auditors to have cybersecurity experience. If you're looking at the financial aspects of the business, then you expect internal auditors to have some financial knowledge and skills in that area. So when you undertake culture audits, it's really important you make sure you have auditors within your team who have sufficient skills and knowledge. And if necessary, you should undertake upskilling and training. And a little bit of a plug here, the Chartered IIA, for example, has a very good virtual course on auditing culture. So if you're interested in that, please do check it out. So before we move on to the next part of the presentation, we have another polling question for you. So the polling question is, what is the biggest barrier to playing a more active role in monitoring and assessing culture? And the options that we have are lack of board and/or audit committee buy-in, lack of resources, increasing regulatory expectations in terms of some of the other risk areas that internal audit looks at, siloed departments, lack of collaboration, lack of clear benchmarks, insufficient skills and/or knowledge, and then we have an other option. So please take a few moments to complete the polling question. I'll be really fascinated to see what your biggest barrier is to auditing culture. So yeah, just take a few moments to complete the poll. So the results are in. So based on this poll, it would seem that the biggest barrier to you playing a more active role in monitoring and assessing culture is lack of resources. We've also got lack of clear benchmarks, interesting. Insufficient skills and or knowledge, relatively high. Lack of board and or audit committee buy-in, relatively high as well. So some interesting results there for us to reflect upon. So moving on now to the next part of the presentation, we've got the importance of equality, diversity and inclusion to corporate culture. And for me, I think this is a really important one. And, you know, the emergence of the Me Too and Black Lives Matter movements have put, you know, huge pressure on organisations to ensure their culture underpins a more equal, diverse and inclusive workplace. And this has meant it's become increasingly important for organisations to ensure that their culture really helps to champion the EDI agenda. And as I touched upon earlier, high-profile EDI-related public scandals, which have affected both public as well as private institutions, have sadly highlighted the damaging consequences of an unhealthy culture. And they've demonstrated the strong interlinkage between EDI and culture and how the two feed one another. So no wonder then that EDI was voted the second biggest risk to impact the culture after human resources. And internal audit has a vital role to play in providing assurance that the culture is supporting the EDI agenda. So this can involve auditing recruitment and retention processes to ensure the organisation is recruiting and retaining a diverse talent pool. And if the organisation has made public statements related to EDI, you know, maybe they've issued statements in support of Me Too or Black Lives Matters, you know, is the organisation really practicing what it preaches in terms of some of those statements? Internal audit can also provide assurance regarding compliance with EDI related to non-financial reporting, gender pay gap reporting, ethnicity pay gap reporting, as well as providing assurance on the integrity of the EDI information and data that's being reported internally as well as externally. However, the clear message from internal auditors that we spoke to as part of the roundtable discussions was that while EDI measures and data can be used to gauge the health of the corporate culture, indeed they should be used, it's important to remember that EDI is a deep topic in its own right that deserves its own airtime. So you know, often EDI deserves its own standalone audit from time to time, but really important to recognise the strong interrelationship between culture and EDI. So next up, why is psychological safety important to audit work on culture? So forgive me, some of you may have already heard this definition before, but for the benefit of those that haven't, psychological safety is a belief that individuals will not be punished, alienated, humiliated, ignored or silenced for voicing ideas, sharing hypotheses, thinking aloud, asking questions, sharing concerns, or highlighting mistakes. In a sense, it can be described as a state of being in the moment. Healthy cultures tend to have higher levels of psychological safety. So because of this, assessing psychological safety can therefore be used as an indicator when examining the health of a culture, and it's linked to EDI in terms of diversity of thinking. The right culture and tone from the top can also support higher levels of psychological safety. This is why there are many internal audit functions that are now assessing psychological safety as part of their culture audits. So this can involve embedding psychological safety questions into surveys, as well as one-to-one interviews and focus groups. And with one-to-one interviews and focus groups, the benefit is that you can then also observe the person's behaviour and their reaction to a question, which can also help you gauge levels of psychological safety. And these questions can then help identify issues with particular teams or particular business functions. And if psychological safety scores are lower, this is likely to mean that you will then find behavioural risk issues. So psychological safety, it's a really important part when auditing culture. So before I move on to the key takeaways from today's session, a quick word on the use of data analytics and artificial intelligence in culture auditing. As hopefully you've all learnt today, culture can be measured. And in the age of big data, there is a whole array of data at internal audit's fingertips that you can harness and then use that data to basically crunch the numbers and identify culture red flags using data analytics. This can include recruitment data, staff survey data, whistleblowing data, customer complaints data, health and safety data, EDI monitoring data. Literally, the list goes on and on. And the use of data analytics in culture audits should, in fact, be non-negotiable, in my view. Some internal audit functions also use dashboards of live metrics that can be monitored on an ongoing basis. And typically, these will be based on 8 or so key characteristics and sets of data. So if you're not doing so already, now is the time to consider using data analytics as part of your culture work. So in beginning to close now, what are the key takeaways and what have we learnt today? Having the right culture aligned to the organisation's purpose, values, strategy and vision for the future is fundamental to the long-term sustainability of organisations. Culture touches upon and interlinks with a wide range of business-critical risk areas. And from a risk culture point of view, it can have a significant impact on the internal control environment. Boards and internal audit should be taking culture and the risks associated with an unhealthy culture a lot more seriously. Boards have a critical role to play in establishing, articulating and embedding the culture, ensuring that it cascades down the entire organisation. And the right tone from the top is vital in achieving this. The entire board has responsibility for the culture. And this includes ensuring that it's monitored, measured and assessed regularly, including seeking independent assurance. Internal audit's main role is to provide assurance that the first and second lines have done their job properly regarding embedding, monitoring and assessing the culture. However, internal audit should periodically carry out its own independent work to monitor, measure and assess the culture. This can include, on occasion, a standalone holistic audit of culture. And a really important message here, internal audit must adopt a proactive approach to its work on culture and not wait for the board to come to you. And if you do have concerns about the culture, then you must be prepared to speak out about it. Culture audit work should be tackled the same way as audits of other areas of the business, and culture auditors should have a certain level of expertise, skills, and knowledge. And to support this, you should consider whether members of the team need training to audit culture, or whether you would value from outside expertise to support your work. So as I mentioned earlier, a number of internal audit functions do now employ organisational psychologists or behavioural risk specialists. So that's definitely an option. So a final word from me before we move on to questions and before I sort of like listen to any insights you may wish to share. Internal audit should be mindful that culture is not a standalone risk that should be tackled in a silo, but it does have a significant impact on a vast array of other business critical risks. Human capital, talent management, and recruitment risk, equality, diversity and inclusion risk, health and safety risk are the most important ones to be mindful of, and these are the ones that have the most impact on the corporate culture. When carrying out an audit of a business critical risk, internal audit should always consider examining the potential impact these risks could be having on the overall culture and vice versa. So with the focus on culture likely to grow in the years ahead, we urge more internal audit functions to now step up and play their part in monitoring, assessing and providing assurance in this space. After this webinar, if you haven't done so already, the first step should be having a conversation with the rest of your team about the risks associated with corporate culture. And to consider how you include culture in your audit work going forwards. So I hope that's been a really useful overview of how internal audit can play a really important part in cultivating a healthy culture. And I'm now very happy to take your questions and listen to any insights or even any practical tips that you would like to share. So Angela, back to you.
Thank you, Gavin. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to type them through the Q&A widget.
So I'm just, gosh, there's a lot of questions. So I'm just having a look at your questions. There are quite a few. Bear with me. So I have one question. Any guidance for auditing implementation of DEI efforts in the organisation? So yes, it is the answer to this. Certainly in terms of the Chartered IIA UK and Ireland, we do have a whole plethora of guidance on our website on basically auditing the implementation of EDI efforts in an organisation. So it covers a whole range of topics. So it covers things like board diversity, gender pay gap, reporting. And in fact, today, just to highlight, we've also published a new discussion paper, and it's basically called Human Capital Diversity and Talent Management, a risk overview. That is available for free on the Chartered IIA's website. So do take a look at the guidance and do take a look at the risk overview that we've published today. So I have another question that's just come in, and it's around audit approaches to cultural auditing. So just really to reiterate what I outlined in the presentation, as I said, there's really no one-size-fits-all approach, and you should feel free to customize your approach depending on your, your individual organization's circumstances. But as I outlined in the presentation, there are really three main approaches that internal audit functions tend to use, as we've explored today. So just to reinforce, the first of those is that you could undertake a standalone audit of culture. And often these are really useful if you want to do a bit of a deep dive and you want to take more of a sort of holistic approach to culture. The Department for Public Expenditure and Reform of the Irish government, their internal audit function, did a really excellent standalone audit of culture, which is included as a case study in the Cultivating a Healthy Culture report. So yeah, number one, standalone audit of culture. Number two is that you can integrate culture into existing audits. So the three areas that I would highlight and the ones that I highlighted in the presentation were basically human resources and talent management. If you're auditing that area as a standard audit, you should definitely be integrating cultural aspects into that audit. The second is if you're doing a standard audit on equality, diversity and inclusion, you should definitely be including cultural aspects on that one. And then if you're doing audits of health, safety and well-being, then again, you should be integrating culture into those audits. And then the third approach is basically continuous auditing. And this is where you basically use every single audit engagement, every interview, to basically observe behaviours, and you can use this to then be continuously auditing the culture. So I hope that answered that question. So I'm now going to move on to the next. And the next question is, how do we get the entire company, including our leadership team, on board with EDI initiatives? And I think this is a really excellent question. And really, I think there are two ways, there are two approaches that you can adopt to this. And really, you should probably use both. But I think the first approach is that basically you can make the business case for greater levels of equality, diversity and inclusion. There are loads of academic research studies that basically demonstrate that those organizations that are most diverse tend to financially outperform their competitors that are less diverse. So there is definitely a financial incentive in terms of making sure organizations are more diverse, more equal, more inclusive. And in fact, there was a study that the Centre for Economics and Business Research carried out in the UK, and they basically calculated that workplace discrimination costs UK businesses a staggering £170 billion a year. That's an astonishing figure. And through the research study they did, they also found that the most diverse organizations tend to perform around 12% better than their less diverse counterparts. So there is definitely a business case to be made, and you can deploy those arguments. However, the one that I think is more compelling is the fairness case. Essentially, this is about doing the right thing. It's the right thing that workplaces should be more equal, diverse, and inclusive. This is also, of course, being driven by stakeholder expectations, expectations of the workforce, expectations of customers, expectations of investors. that's really how the arguments that I would deploy, or the approaches that I would use in basically getting the leadership team on board. You can deploy the business case or the fairness case, ideally both. So moving on to the next question. What are the best frameworks to measure and report this activity? So there are a number of frameworks that we've included as examples in the reports, Cultivating a Healthy Culture. So please do take a look. But the framework for measuring and reporting culture that I would highlight is basically the Financial Services Culture Board's culture framework. And this is used by many of the financial services firms here in the UK to help them to monitor and assess the corporate culture. And it basically includes things like competence, reliability, responsiveness, personal resilience, accountability, openness, respect, and honesty. They're all on the framework. And basically, these are all things that internal audit in financial services will basically measure and report against in their culture audits. And there's absolutely no reason why internal audit functions outside of financial services can't use the Financial Services Culture Board culture framework. So I would definitely encourage you to take a look. And if necessary, if it's not quite the right framework for you, then you can use it as a template and you can adapt it for your individual organization's circumstances. There's also the Institutes for Risk Management's culture framework, but this is more useful in terms of better understanding the different aspects of culture. But as I say, both of those frameworks are included in the report. So yeah, please do take a look in more depth. So the next question now, which areas should be focused for corporate culture? So just to reinforce some of the key messages from the presentation, really the three areas that should be most focused for corporate culture are basically human resources and talent management. That was voted the #1 risk to most impact the corporate culture. You've then got equality, diversity and inclusion, which was the second biggest risk. And third, you've got health, safety and well-being. So definitely those three should be the most focused for corporate culture. But I think it's also important to be mindful that there are other areas where corporate culture is really important. So, for example, cybersecurity. Many of you will be auditing cybersecurity. Well, does the organisation have a healthy cybersecurity awareness culture? Because something like over 80% of all cyber attacks could be prevented by basic cyber hygiene measures. So again, this is another really good example of where culture is really important. Another one, fraud. So do you have a fraud prevention culture? So again, these are areas where you may wish to have a focus on culture. So I'm now going to move to the last question because we've only literally got a couple of minutes left, but very happy to respond to more of your questions after today's session. For those of you who would find that helpful, but let's just move on then to the last question. How does a lack of focus on EDI become a risk factor for culture? Well, the first thing to say is that a lack of focus on EDI absolutely is a risk factor. Indeed, EDI was voted the second biggest risk to impact the corporate culture. And what I would say here is we've seen a number of high-profile scandals that have been linked to EDI issues. So the example that we cite in the report is the Yorkshire County Cricket Club, who recently had to deal with a racism scandal. This really did underline how a corporate culture crisis, can have a devastating impact on reputation, on public trust, and on long-term sustainability. Because, of course, when that happened, all of the cricket club's sponsors pulled out, and that created a huge financial black hole. So really, this demonstrates very clearly how a lack of focus on EDI can really become, a really sort of business critical risk. So anyway, I hope you found the session today useful, and you've got some sort of guidance and insights and some good takeaways to be going on with. Angela, back to you.
Thank you, Gavin, and thank you to everybody for joining us. For those not familiar with AuditBoard, we are an award-winning cloud solution helping to transform how audit, risk, and compliance professionals manage today's dynamic risk landscape. We do this with a modern, connected platform that helps you engage your front lines, surface the risks that matter, and drive better strategic decision-making. Our customers range from prominent pre-IPO to Fortune 50 companies. We're also the top-rated audit management software on G2 and Gartner Peer Insights. To learn more or schedule a product walkthrough, please visit auditboard.com. And we're also excited to share that you can now register for AuditBoard's free virtual event, InfoSec Compliance Now, taking place on April 28th. Join industry leaders to explore the hot topics, emerging trends, and progressive approaches advancing the security compliance field today. The registration link is available through the banner below the presentation slides, as well as the resource list. And with that, we'll go ahead and end today's webinar. Thank you again to everyone for joining us. If you have any questions, please reach out to events@auditboard.com. We hope to see you next time.